Well, howdy, church. Welcome to the first episode of season 2 of our midweek devotional. If you're new to this, basically every summer we walk through a book of the Bible together, and we accompany that with some bonus content in the midweek where we just will talk a little bit more about maybe some of the stories or some of the people in the book that we're talking through and walking through. And this year, we're in the Gospel of John, and our midweek devotional we'll be really talking a lot about the people in the story. And so I'm going to jump right into it with asking the question, who wrote the Gospel of John? Who is John? Some people, every now and then you'll hear, will kind of wrongly say, oh, this is John the Baptist who wrote the Gospel of John. And they say this for one reason, and that is because right in the middle of John chapter 1, there's this little part about how there's a man named John, and he came to bear witness of the light, and he's not the light, but that doesn't mean that John the Baptist wrote the Gospel of John. In fact, we realize this because John the Baptist's story ends much before Jesus' story ends, and yet the story of the Gospel of John continues to be written. Now, some people will say, well, this is a man named John the Elder who wrote this long after Jesus and all of his disciples are gone, and there perhaps might be some truth to that, but there's almost 9 men named John in the New Testament, and so it can get a little tricky as to who's who, and so the common person associated with writing the Gospel of John, who I believe wrote the Gospel of John, is this man named John the Beloved. John the Beloved is this fascinating, wonderful character in the Bible. He calls himself the disciple whom Jesus loves. I love that he introduces himself as the disciple whom Jesus loves. This is a very important thing because what this means is that he understood that Jesus defines him as a human being and not as a human doing. John wrote this gospel and understood that to Jesus, he is a person who he loves. He's not solely something that he does for Jesus. And so he writes this, and when he writes this, he is the oldest living member of the apostles. All of the other apostles are gone. They've all passed away. Most of them have been martyred. Some of them have gone to other countries and been martyred there. And John is this elderly man. This is why some people call him John the Elder. This is an elderly man who is writing this book. And when he writes it, he is the most important living church figure at the time. Now, we all understand Jesus is the most important person in the history of the church. But what we're saying is that at the time, he is kind of the premier living person who can point directly back to Jesus and say, this is who Jesus is. He is the most important living church figure, and he is extremely humble. Now, this is so important. He never says his own name. Let me think about this. The man writes a book that Augustine says is deep enough that an elephant can swim in it, and yet shallow enough that an infant won't drown. Martin Luther later on would say that this, along with the book of Romans, if the rest of the Bible were destroyed, but we had John and Romans, we would still be okay. So he's the most important living figure in the church. He would basically be, I guess, our equivalent would be, take every denominational head, turn them into one person, and all of the church would look to that person and say, hey, tell us what's going on with this. Tell us and this is who John is. So he's so important, and yet he never says his own name in the gospel that he writes. Now, he mentions Jesus a lot, and he mentions the Old Testament a lot. In fact, he references the Old Testament or quotes it 500 times in all of his writings. And he talks continually about Jesus, and he has this one major theme for writing the Gospel of John. And that major theme is simply pointing out who Jesus is. So his overriding theme in the Gospel of John is that he wants us to know who Jesus is. And he wants us to know who Jesus is more than he wants us to know who he is. I love the humility of John. To describe himself as the disciple whom Jesus loves and then to spend all of his time focusing on Jesus and just pointing out, hey, this is who Jesus is. So this is who wrote the Gospel of John. And I'm excited to continue to walk through this gospel. We know that he's very humble. We know that he's a very important church figure. We know that he's up in years. And we know that he's the disciple whom Jesus loves. And I find his humility to be so refreshing. And I find that the more I look into the Gospel of John, the more I am excited about walking through this together with you in our midweek devotional. Always remember, church, that you matter.